Guess what time it is? It's Gainz-Thirty. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Gainz-Thirty. I'm your host, Mitchell Boris, and today we're talking about supplements with Steven Machek. He's a PhD student. He's working on getting his doctorate, and he knows a lot about supplements, so I decided to have him on here and discuss things about creatine, protein powder, amino acids, and all the different supplements you can find on the market, whether or not they're safe and effective, and who needs to take them. I remember there was a point in time where I didn't know anything about supplements, and there was so much information on the internet saying different things that said either, oh, this supplement is good and this supplement is bad. So today we're here to get the facts straight. We're talking about the science, and we're trying to tell you what supplements are scientifically proven to be effective. I have Steven here, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself.
My name is Steven Machek. I'm a, third year PhD student at Baylor University, working under Dr. Darren Willoughby. My focus is around muscle physiology, sports nutrition, kind of the intersection between those two things. And right now I'm doing my dissertation, which will, once I'm done with that, it'll allow me to finally finish up. Right now I feel like I'm in 25th grade, so it's going to be great to not be in school anymore. But, the ultimate objective is to go and teach at a university. So I guess I'm perpetually going to be in school. But yeah, that's the general spiel about me. If you want to know anything specific about previous degrees or anything like that too, I can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you came into Dr. Bagley's class and you talked about this research that you were doing for
Mm.
your thesis, and you talked about blood flow restriction and betaine, the
Betaine.
combination. Betaine, I
There you go.
pronounced it differently. I remember when you were saying it, I was like, wait, what's that? And I saw the word and I was like, oh, okay. You
Yeah,
call it
yeah.
you call it betaine?
Betaine, yeah.
Okay.
I just like, I'm not trying to correct you or anything like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
but I've heard some people like there's other things. One guy has called it butane one time, and definitely not butane. And then one person said betadine, which is actually like a form of iodine that's not, yeah, it's a form of iodine that's prescribed for like antiseptic purposes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that research real quick? Like what
Sure.
exactly you're doing?
Yeah, so basically the entire crux of the project is looking at how these two things, blood flow restriction and betaine supplementation, might work synergistically. So the idea is that these two things kind of work very separately. They have their different mechanisms, but they do kind of share a commonality when it comes to kind of the transfer of liquid or the transfer of fluid from one compartment to another compartment within the muscle. So blood flow restriction training, what you're doing is you're putting a cuff that's occluding. But you're basically preventing blood from going back up to the heart, but you're pooling all that blood in the limb that's being restricted. So if I were to put a set of cuffs around both of my legs, what would happen is I would be exercising, I would be accumulating blood because we're not completely restricting blood to the limb. We're just preventing a large portion of it from coming back up, and we're majorly restricting the amount that's going into the muscle. So by doing that, it allows blood to pool in those particular areas. And so the idea of adding betaine came in there because betaine has a few different functions, but the main function that I wanted to focus on was how betaine is what we consider to be an osmolyte. So it draws water with it. So basically where the betaine goes, the water goes.
Yeah.
So the idea with the betaine as well as the BFR, and kind of long story short here, is that we're allowing a greater saturation of that fluid to occur at the level of the muscle, but also allow the cell to kind of return back to its normal osmotic gradient a little bit more readily.
Yeah, that's interesting. It almost sounds like the blood flow restriction is like tricking the muscle into thinking it's doing more than it actually is. It's kind of like
Definitely.
manipulating your own physiology. Yeah, that's the reason I have you on here is I thought your research was pretty interesting and I felt like you'd have the knowledge to talk about some of these things.
Definitely.
So, yeah, this whole episode today is about supplements. And what I first want to ask you is, are supplements for everybody?
I definitely don't think that supplements are for everybody. I think that supplements are something that should be considered once you've kind of evaluated your own diet. You doing your own research, or I mean, even better, talking to a registered dietitian or a respectable nutritionist is always going to be the better option I think a lot of days people assume that that supplements are for everybody, and so you just kind of haphazardly buy a lot of these things, and you're, in the best case scenario, you're just wasting money and you're just peeing out the rest of it. In the worst case scenario, I think everyone knows that vitamin D is something that is, generally lacking in the population. But if you don't do blood assessments or dietary assessments and you overconsume something like vitamin D, which is a fat soluble vitamin, it's going to accumulate. And it's actually going to, and this always stuck with me. My nutrition instructor during my undergrad told me that if you overconsume vitamin D, you'll just have more calcium floating around in the bloodstream, because that's the function of vitamin D, is to help with calcium regulation. And overall, what that can do is it can actually cause like calcium mediated plaques to occur. So what I'm trying to get at is there's a fine line between the dangers and the maximal benefits of supplementation, right? So
Yeah.
it's not everyone needs them, that's for sure.
Yeah, so it sounds like you can almost overdo it with the supplement, and it would be just as bad as if you didn't have any of that certain compound in your body.
Definitely.
Okay. So that being said, it's like supplements aren't for everybody, but we usually associate supplementations with athletes, weightlifters, and whatnot. So, what specific population do you think should even consider supplementing?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question, because I think that there's so many different supplements that are out on the market. It
Yeah.
kind of depends on what your focus definitely is, right? Because there are some
Okay.
people where like a multivitamin could be a good idea. That being a supplement, vitamins and minerals and whatnot, especially if their diet is severely lacking a lot of just these basic nutrients. What you might be getting at too is athletic populations. I mean, depending on gender as well. Like iron supplements might be a little bit more implicated in a female athlete, especially as they get older and they go through menstruation. You just have more blood losses that are occurring. So that's why iron deficiency anemia is a fairly prominent issue in female athletes. Other things, I mean, we already talked a little bit about vitamin D. There's some minerals, the magnesium, calcium, all those things are going to be a little bit more implicated in athletes, just because they have a little bit more demands on those systems, more turnover. You have a lot more impacts. So you have more bone turnover. You have more metabolism going on. So you need to be fueling a lot of those processes with the adequate nutrients involved.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a lot of different supplements out there, and they all do so many different things. I'm going to bring up a few different supplements that are very common in the fitness community. And I want to talk about what they do, who should be taking them, and how do you consume them, like what dosages and
Sure.
whatnot. So, a really popular one in the fitness community, especially among weightlifters, is creatine. Now, is creatine safe to consume and does it work? Can you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Definitely. So whenever I think about sports supplementation, the big two that always comes to mind are caffeine and creatine. Those are the ones that have the most scientific research backing them. And I would say that between those two, creatine is probably the one that is going to do the maximum benefit with the least amount of harm for most people. So just to get it out of the way already, a lot of people will say that creatine supplementation isn't going to be beneficial because it's going to ruin your kidney health. You'll hear a lot of different things, but people will say
Yep,
kidney
I've heard
health.
that one before.
Yeah. So I think that stems from a lot of misconceptions. It stems from a lot of athletes who have kind of run their bodies into the ground, and they just also happen to be taking creatine at the same time.
Okay.
And then you'll see certain values, like you'll see massive amounts of this marker called creatine kinase, which usually shows up as a marker of muscle damage. And if you're exercising profusely, you're definitely going to see that in the blood a lot. But that's not because you're taking, it's not because the creatine itself is damaging you. It's just a function of the muscle tissue being damaged and then leaking out some of its cellular components. You might also see elevated creatinine, which is a byproduct of creatine. And typically, if you're going to your doctor or let's say even a nephrologist who isn't super savvy on things like creatine supplementation, they might see elevated creatinine simply as a byproduct of taking more creatine, whether that be, dietarily or as a supplement. And they might see that that's kind of a red flag. But in reality, that's something that is fairly normal if you're taking some type of supplementation. So creatine itself is extremely effective, and I honestly, just from some of the research that I've done on creatine, Dr. Bagley and I wrote a review on creatine for cognitive performance actually
Okay.
in 2018. And by reading that, I definitely think that there are more populations that could actually benefit from a standardized dose of creatine than not. And we can kind of go into some of those populations if you want me to.
Yeah, of course. So you're saying that some people respond to it better than others?
Yeah, so if we want to talk about non-responders versus responders, that's a concept that's pretty popular too. And usually the only difference between a responder and a non-responder is how much creatine they already have just without taking anything. So maybe their
Oh, okay.
diet's a little bit higher in creatine, and we tend to see higher amounts of creatine in things like red meat.
Oh, okay.
Um,
That's
yeah,
actually an
so
interesting point because I don't eat any meat. I'm vegan.
mhm,
So consuming creatine for me, I found to be very effective.
yeah,
And I've had my blood work done, and my creatine levels weren't low because it's to my understanding that my body will make some of it on its own.
right,
But when I started consuming creatine, I noticed a huge boost in strength because it was just giving my muscles a compound it didn't have before.
yeah,
Um, but that kind of leads me to another question is like, for someone who's never taken creatine before, how is it going to help them perform better? Like, is it going to
right.
help them exercise longer? Or is it just going to help them be more explosive? Like, what exactly is it going to do for someone? Like, what sort of result should someone expect when they take creatine?
Right. To not get super into the bioenergetics of it, we basically have a few different pathways by which we can produce energy. We can burn fats for energy, that which usually requires a lot of oxygen. We can burn carbohydrates the same way, or we can use the carbohydrate that's stored in our muscle. So that's called glycogen. We can also use the stuff in our liver, but that usually gets turned into glucose and then shuttled from there to the muscle where it's going to be used for muscular performance. But utilizing glycogen at the level of the muscle doesn't require any oxygen, and it produces it produces ATP or energy, but it doesn't produce it in a very efficient manner like it would with oxygen available. And then the other pathway would be the immediate pathway, also known as the creatine phosphate or the phosphagen system. And so basically, all that does is you can imagine that we have an ATP, and an ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So basically, it's an adenosine with three phosphate molecules kind of bonded together towards the end of it. And in between those phosphates, we have those bonds. And when we break apart those bonds, that's energy that we can use. So we take an ATP, we break off that last phosphate group, and we have that energy that's available. So what creatine actually does is creatine can store excess phosphate groups. So it can attach to a phosphate and form something called creatine phosphate. And when we're in a position where we need more energy, it can actually just break that phosphate back off of it and attach it onto that ATP that lost the phosphate. So it's actually called adenosine diphosphate. So basically, what it's doing, long story short, is it's helping us recycle energy. And because it's just a quick removal of one phosphate group from creatine onto that ADP, it's much faster than needing oxygen to go through all these different reactions, and even faster than utilizing glycogen for energy through glycolysis. So
Okay.
it's a fast way of producing energy, and it usually exists within the muscle itself, kind of like glycogen already. So you don't need to transport anything anywhere like we do with fat. It's right
Okay.
there already, so we can kind of use that for
Yeah.
energy.
So I have some creatine here.
Yeah,
Basically, when I consume this creatine, it's going to go through my bloodstream and enter the muscles, and then it'll be there ready to break down to create energy for when I exercise,
right,
particularly like in that very first burst of an exercise. Like
right,
I'm doing like bench press, for example. It's like those first two, 3 reps, I'm probably only breaking down this creatine, maybe a little bit of fats and a little bit of carbs as well. But
hmm,
this is my main source of energy when I'm doing those first few seconds of exercise.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So anywhere between the start of exercise up until about 20 seconds, depending on how you kind of where your
Yeah.
stores are at.
Yeah. So normally my body would produce a little bit of this,
Hmm.
but if I consume more of it, I'll have more of it in store in my muscles so that during those first few seconds of exercise, I'm going to get the most out of it. I'm not going to be wasting my glycogen stores. I'm not going to be burning much fat. I'm just going to be utilizing this creatine. And that's
Exactly.
really going to
Yeah.
help me perform better if I'm a weightlifter or maybe even like a sprinter or someone who's doing short bursts of energy.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think there is some application too for endurance runners. So, I mean, endurance running, for the most part, you're going to be utilizing a lot of fat because it's not super intense. You don't need all of that energy readily available. The demand for ATP isn't massive to the point where it's kind of superseding the amount of oxygen that's available to create it. But I mean, let's say you're running a 10K and you need to beat someone who you're neck and neck with. You're going to be sprinting a little bit.
Yeah,
And I would
definitely.
argue that the person that's supplementing with the creatine and, full has, relatively closer to full glycogen stores, if maybe they've been sipping on some carbohydrate or something like that. So those two things together are going to help them produce more of that ATP in that particular moment to be able to sprint and beat the other person or the other person they're racing against.
Okay, that's an interesting point because I've never thought of creatine as being something that's actually beneficial for an endurance athlete. But when you bring up that point where, yeah, an endurance athlete is sometimes going to have to sprint or go at maximum effort, those creatine stores will help them. So,
Definitely.
yeah. So, I got this creatine supplement. Let's say I've never taken it before. How much of it should I take, and how often do I take it? Like what's the
Yeah.
protocol for consuming creatine so that I get the most out of it and I keep myself safe?
Yeah. So the first thing I think is that I'm glad that you had a bottle of micronized creatine monohydrate, which is our gold standard. Yeah. So I mean, that is, how much did you pay for that tub? Probably like 20, $30 at the most, something like
Yeah,
that.
I think it was like $30 and it has 245 gram servings. This will
Yeah.
last me like months if I
Right.
take it every day. So,
That's the best thing about creatine is that the gold standard, the tried, tested, and true version of it is exactly what you have right there, the creatine monohydrate. And that all you need is, so there's a few different ways that you can supplement it. If you're trying to load it up, which basically just means you're taking large amounts of it to try to saturate your muscles, to kind of fill up your muscles with creatine as fast as possible. The more general dose is 20 grams per day. You can split that up through multiple doses. You can do multiple 5 gram or a couple 10 gram doses. It's not super imperative. If you're trying to waste the least amount possible, so you're just gonna, if you just consume all 20 grams at once, you're probably just gonna process it faster and you're gonna excrete the rest out. So trying to break it up a
okay.
little bit. That's gonna be 20 grams a day for a week.
Hmm.
The more kind of individualistic dose would be zero point 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. So that would prevent you from wasting as much. So if you calculate that, how much do you weigh?
I weigh let's say 200 pounds, nice square
200
number.
pounds. So
That's
like
90
90-ish
kilos.
kilos. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
what was
that
the number you said per kilo?
zero point 0.3.
So that means I would need to consume 27 grams of creatine for
Yeah.
my size.
Right. So that's a more individualized approach. Someone like myself, I only weigh like a buck 60, so I wouldn't be consuming as much. So that's what, like
Mhm.
65 and 60 times 3. Yeah, so 21 grams per day.
Okay.
Um, if you don't need to be saturated with it, there's not really any reason to load it because you're just going to end up wasting whatever ends up getting converted to not get stored and ends up getting converted or excreted. So the more individualized approach would be 0.03 grams per day. So that would be, for me, that's only about 2.5 grams.
Hmm.
And then for the other dosage would be just, the more generalized approach would be 5 grams per day. That's usually what you'll see on the internet, is just kind of take
Yeah.
a teaspoon and that ends up being about 5 grams.
Okay.
Um,
So I got a quick question actually. I've been consuming about 5 to 10 grams of that a day.
yeah,
So you're saying I could consume up to like over 20 grams of that a day and still see results from it.
if you aren't loaded. So the
Hmm.
entire idea is, the point of supplementing with creatine is you're trying to get yourself saturated with the creatine, right? So that you
Hmm.
have a higher capacity to basically recycle ATP or recycle energy. So
Okay.
if you, let's say you've never supplemented with creatine in your life before and you have a competition in a week, maybe you'd want to do that loading protocol. But on a daily basis, this was kind of where I was going. You could just do a maintenance dose or that smaller dose of that 0.03 grams per day. So not zero point 0.3, but 0.03 grams per
Oh,
day.
okay. That's a really small amount.
Very small
Just a little
amount.
pinch of it.
Right, exactly. So for you, I mean, that's your 90 kilos times 0.03. That's only 2.7 grams per day.
Oh,
And you could
okay.
get away with, I mean, creatine itself isn't very expensive in the first place, but that's about half of that 5-gram teaspoon. So if you don't want to
Yeah.
think about it, you can definitely just take the teaspoon and you can just put that into whatever shake. I wouldn't recommend kind of dry scooping it into your mouth. It's pretty dry. But you could do that. You'd just be potentially wasting about half of that serving.
If you put it into
Which,
your mouth directly.
oh no, I'm just saying, like, if you're taking 5 grams, right, with a
Oh,
teaspoon
okay.
versus the more individualized 0.03 grams
Okay.
per kilogram.
So I should basically be, if I haven't taken it in a while, I feel like my creatine stores are empty, or if I've
Mhm.
never taken it, I should take like a loading phase and consume maybe upwards to, around 20 grams a day.
Mhm.
But then following that, after a week, I should decrease the dose and just try to maintain my creatine stores.
Yeah, and I would say that you don't even need that loading dose if you don't need it to work as fast as possible within a certain time frame.
I
So
see. But if
like
I'm
if
about to
I
attempt a 1 rep max, I should be consuming a little bit more of that creatine then. Make sure
right.
those creatine stores are topped off.
Right. Like let's say that you're testing a 1 rep max in a couple weeks and you need to make sure you're topped off as well as possible because you haven't consumed creatine in a while, then yeah, you would probably want to load that up. But if you don't have any performance demands within, I would probably say a month, just doing that maintenance dose of pretty generalized 5 grams per day or, 0.03 grams per kilogram of body weight. In about a month, that'll get you to full saturation. You don't have to do the loading phase in order to get saturated, but you do
Okay.
need to take it at that maintenance dose, basically in perpetuity. So as long as possible in order to maximize on the benefits of it.
Okay. So if I take too much of it, you're making it sound like it's not too big of a deal. I'll just excrete it through my urine.
Right. And, I don't have
Okay.
a specific number on how much you can consume and not have it affect you, because obviously if you start, taking half the tub and shoving it down your mouth, I can't guarantee that there
Yeah,
aren't going to be any
definitely.
problems, right?
Yeah.
But if you're 5 grams over, 10 grams over, 20 grams over, maybe it's probably just going to end up with you're probably just going to have some type of stomach ache because creatine's an osmolyte too, kind of like betaine. It
Hmm.
draws water into it. That's one of the benefits of creatine too, is
Yeah.
it draws water into the cell.
I see. But it could
Um,
backfire if you ate spoonfuls of it.
yeah, yeah, you might end up on the toilet for a little bit, or at least with
Okay.
some significant tummy troubles.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's a lot of information about creatine. I
Yeah.
think if
Um,
someone was listening to this and they hadn't heard about creatine, I think they'd have an idea of how to use it and what it's used for.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
before you move on, I didn't mean to interrupt you
Oh
there.
yeah, go for it if you got more.
Is there's a lot of research nowadays coming out about creatine for cognitive purposes. So especially for someone like
Okay.
yourself that is vegan, or even if you're vegetarian and you're not consuming a lot of meat, there can be a lot of benefit for just a normal dose of creatine monohydrate. Just being able to improve certain things like forward and backward memory and just general recall, reaction time. There's decent data to show that creatine can actually help with increasing levels of creatine in the brain. So that's being used in the brain to kind of create like an energy buffer to be able
Hmm.
to help you with normal like neuron energy processing. And actually, they've even shown in pregnant women, so pregnant women who are consuming creatine, that creatine can actually cross over the placental barrier. And the
Hmm.
baby, when they're born, is actually less likely to have some type of hypoxic event. So let's say like they have some type of situation where they're not getting the amount of oxygen necessary due to whatever reason. They actually have better outcomes and they're less likely to have some type of long-term damage because they had that energy available to keep all of those systems and tissues going like normal.
Okay. So like, let's say there's someone who's vegan or vegetarian, and let's say they're not necessarily an athlete, like they're just, casually exercising. They're not looking for the performance benefits. Do you think that person should be consuming a little bit of creatine to get those cognitive benefits?
Definitely, I definitely think so. As long as, I mean, this is the major caveat here. As long as there's no kind of kidney issues,
Hmm.
then I would assume that consuming that creatine is going to be beneficial and pretty much like very low risk in terms of economically speaking. So the cost of the supplement is very low, and the benefit that you can glean from it is very large.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I've never really thought of it as a thing that will benefit me cognitively. I've just thought, oh, it'll help me in the gym, but that's pretty
Yeah.
cool that it does that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, creatine monohydrate is the way to go. You're going to see a lot of people that are marketing things like creatine, ethyl ester, or hydrochloride, all these
Yeah, I've
different.
heard of those. Yeah.
Yeah, and the most studied supplement would be the creatine monohydrate. If you consume some of those other things, there's not really any evidence to show that it's superior. It's in the best case scenario going to be the same.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things are touting that they have better bioavailability or better
Mhm.
absorption than creatine monohydrate, but creatine monohydrate is, 98, 99% absorbed already. So it's not
Yeah.
going to make a big difference. And you're usually paying a premium for having basically something that's not going to make a whole lot of difference attached to it.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, if you're taking creatine monohydrate, it's basically pure creatine. So if you're taking 5 grams of creatine, you're getting 5 grams of creatine. If you get creatine hydrochloride, you're getting creatine and you're getting hydrochloric acid attached to it that's going to dissociate in the stomach.
That doesn't
So
sound too good.
I mean, hydrochloric acid's already in your stomach, but
uh,
like, let's say it's half and half. So let's say you take 5 grams of creatine hydrochloride. You're only getting 2.5 grams of creatine. The other 2.5 grams is the
mhm.
hydrochloride. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So it sounds like this is the way to go right here.
That is indeed the way
Micronized,
to go.
100% pure creatine monohydrate. That's what you
That's
want to look
right.
for if you're getting some creatine. Not saying the other stuff is bad, but much more under researched. And this creatine monohydrate's got a lot of research behind it. So we've
Yep.
learned it's safe, it's effective, and it's going to help you make some gains. So,
That's right. And it
yeah.
is, like I said, it's probably one of the most studied supplements out there. A lot of people are trying to reinvent the wheel, but they don't need to reinvent the wheel. So, I mean, I love it so much that I
Yeah.
have it tattooed on my arm. I don't know if you can see that.
Is that
So,
a creatine molecule?
yeah, it's a
That's a
creatine
cool
molecule.
tattoo. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So earlier you mentioned caffeine as being one of the more studied supplements that helps our athletic performance.
Yeah,
So there's this whole class of supplements that are pre-workout supplements. I actually have one right here. And I want to know what you think about pre-workout supplements because there's a lot of them on the market and there's a lot of controversy about them. And basically, the way I see a pre workout supplement is it is this cocktail of various different compounds that may or may not be good for you. So, I'd like to hear your opinion about pre workout supplements.
sure. So I would definitely think that regardless of what pre-workout supplement you have, 99% of the time, the one ingredient that's doing it for you is probably going to be the caffeine in there.
Okay.
There are some other, like there are some pre-workout supplements in there that have some creatine in them. They'll have some other compounds in there that are beneficial, like citrulline malate or beta alanine. But for the most part, what ends up happening is a lot of these things are underdosed with the effective compounds in them. So just because you have a compound in there that's been demonstrated to be effective does not mean that it's in the right dosage to be effective.
Okay. I have a
Uh,
great example of that actually. So,
sure.
this is driven pre workout by MRM Nutrition. Stimulant free, so there's no PEDs in it. I'm always trying to watch out for things like that. Um, but it has cordyceps mushrooms in it. And I've read some research that says cordyceps mushrooms are good for increasing your testosterone and whatnot. But I was looking at the dosage in that particular study, and it was saying like consuming 2 grams daily, which is 200 milligrams.
Hmm.
In this, there is cordyceps mushrooms, but there are 250 milligrams of cordyceps mushrooms in it. So, with that being said, this has about an eighth of the amount of cordyceps that they were using in that study that showed it to be significantly boosting our testosterone
Right.
levels. But they put it in this pre workout and they're like, oh, it's got cordyceps in it. It's going to help you make some gains. But
Yep.
honestly, that's not really the case. It's almost like I'm just getting a little sprinkle of it. And it might have some effect, but sure not as significant as what's going on in these studies that proved it to be good.
Right. Yeah, that's a good example actually right there of having the entire stimulant-free pre-workout thing that's kind of coming onto the market. And it's a really smart thing that the industry did because a lot of these compounds that they're adding in are actually really expensive to add into it. So you're paying a premium for something that may or may not work as well as if you had the caffeine alternative there.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, just having some of those herbal compounds, like there's a lot of hype behind these different mushroom compounds nowadays, and there definitely there's a lot of good evidence behind them, but they're very varied in their effects, and they are also very widely varied in the dosage necessary in order to elicit some of those effects. So
Yeah.
that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. So I mentioned how this is a stimulant-free pre-workout. Do you mind telling us what stimulants are, like,
Sure.
and how they differ from something like caffeine?
Yeah. So like caffeine is a stimulant. I mean, stimulants
Okay,
can
yeah.
range anywhere from things that are supposed to be promoting cognitive function. So you can look at some of those things, like for example, you had the cordyceps mushrooms in there. There are other mushrooms that are specifically designated for cognitive function. There are other things that are supposed to be like precursors to acetylcholine, which is a major neurotransmitter. So things like CDP choline, um, other herbal compounds like astragalus, I think. I'm probably butchering that name, but they're basically just compounds that are supposed to affect either the way that neurotransmitters are released or trying to prevent their reuptake. So kind of like similar to how an SSRI would work, even though that's a drug, that's a very powerful
Hmm.
drug. Once part of the way that SSRIs work is they prevent serotonin from being reuptaken into the presynaptic neuron. So basically, you're just keeping that neurotransmitter there versus releasing more of it. So a good example would also be like amphetamine. Amphetamine increases the release of neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, all the dopamine, things like that, and also prevents them from going back up into the preceding neuron. So that's how that maintains such a high degree of efficacy, is that it's doing all of these different things at once. So
Yeah,
that's
that's
those are examples of stimulants.
okay. Yeah. So there was a point in my life where I was probably like 18, right out of high school, and there's all these supplements on the market, and we're trying to do whatever it takes to make some gains at the time. We're playing football, and so we find these pre-workouts, and little did I know at the time, a lot of them have stimulants, and I didn't even realize it at the time. But I thought it was just, the fact that they put 400 milligrams of caffeine in some pre-workout. I'm taking it, and I'm wired and I'm focused. But a few years down the line, I realized, oh, these have stimulants in it, and I realized stimulants are a drug, and they're basically like a class of amphetamines. So I began to steer away from them. But that was something I wanted to discuss in this podcast, was how there's pre-workouts out there that are stimulant free. They might just have some caffeine or even no caffeine. And then there's pre-workouts out there that are legally being sold that have a lot of compounds in them that aren't necessarily legal and I would claim safe to consume. So,
Yeah.
yeah, do you have any insight on that and what kind of
Yeah.
things go on in the pre-workout market?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even back then, how old are you?
I'm 24.
24. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember back when the old Jack
Jack
3D
3D.
form.
Yep, I've heard
Yeah,
of that
everyone
one.
always references that one. So a lot of those pre-workout formulations that existed, they had a lot of caffeine, but they also had what we consider to be like meth analogs. So they were things that were very
Yeah.
similar to methamphetamine in
It's
their
basically like
structure.
they sprinkle a little Adderall in the pre-workout, get people hooked on it,
Exactly. Exactly. It's definitely like that. And I mean, yeah, that stuff definitely works. The problem is that stuff, number one, if you're an athlete, that'll flag. So that's definitely not going to be legal in different federations
So you
like
can't do
WADA.
like the NCAA or
Right.
anything where it's WADA tested, like
Yeah.
natural bodybuilding or natural
Right.
powerlifting. So
Yeah. So those supplements have definitely been flagged over the years, and they've had to change their formulations. So usually what ends up happening is those supplement companies, they end up combining like with some of those other more expensive compounds, the ones that aren't necessarily as proven, or potentially what they might do is they might include more caffeine, which there is a dose, a recommended dose for caffeine, anywhere between like 4 and 6 milligrams per kilogram for performance. But sometimes, especially if you're daily consuming upwards of 400, potentially more milligrams of caffeine, what can happen is you end up with a very high tolerance for that caffeine, and you need to consume more and more in order to kind of elicit the same performance benefits. And I think I'm not trying to get super deep, but uh, our society in general has such an issue with stimulants, and specifically, I think caffeine, because it's probably the most widely accepted drug.
It's very
Um,
normalized, yeah.
it is,
Still
yeah,
a
and
drug nonetheless, though. Like,
definitely. I think one of the reasons for that is let's kind of pitching that or juxtaposing that to alcohol. There's a stigma behind alcohol that we kind of think of like people that are, alcoholics or drunkards. They're very non-functioning. But caffeine, you consume more caffeine, no one's going to be getting on you for being lazy. And that's the thing is people
yeah,
consume caffeine to work. They don't drink alcohol to work, right? And so I think that that's why it's been such a heavily emphasized drug, and one that's very socially normal. I mean, look at Starbucks, man. Like you go to Starbucks, you have people that are drinking like 400 plus milligrams of caffeine, maybe sometimes 2 or 3 times daily. And no one's getting on Starbucks for getting people hooked on drugs, right?
it's true. I mean, like the way you frame that, it sounds really extreme, but it's like it's kind of the reality of the situation. Is like caffeine is a drug, but it's such a normalized drug, and like what you said, like no one's getting on you about taking too much caffeine. It's like
Yeah.
you kind of blend in with society like that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to bring up a point about the stimulants is that I noticed that in the gym, a lot of people are taking these pre-workouts with stimulants, and yeah, it's working for them, but I don't know what the side effects will be in the long run. But it's almost becoming normalized for people to use these stimulants and pre-workouts, and like people are like hitting the gym for the first time, and their buddy's like, "Oh, try this pre-workout," and
Right.
it's got whatever stimulants in it, and
Yeah.
it gets people hooked, and they want to buy more of it, and yeah,
Yeah.
I've been through the whole cycle of that, and luckily I caught myself doing it. I was like, wait, whoa, like that's not
Yeah.
good. Like I can't be doing this. Like,
Oh, believe me, man. Like I'm addicted to caffeine like fully, and I'm not proud of it per se. It's just something that's been kind of a necessity to get me through the day. Yeah,
yeah,
so not proud of it. I definitely wouldn't tattoo caffeine on me, but yeah. So I mean, you kind of bring up the whole pre-workout thing too, and I wanted to touch on the fact that like pre-workouts or even some of these energy drinks nowadays, it's not just the caffeine. It's there's other things that are included in there, and we don't necessarily know how those things are reacting together. So like it's not like everyone's grabbing just coffee or just caffeine pills. They're taking pre-workouts that have a bunch of other different compounds in them that could be helping in the moment, but chronically we have no idea how these things are going to combine to affect things like hemodynamic factors, or blood pressure, or heart rate, all of those things at the forefront. And then with other things like pre-workouts, you have other compounds that we can't necessarily say that it's the whole concoction that's working. It might just be 2 or 3 ingredients in there, and we're paying a premium for a concoction or a cocktail of these different things. And when in reality, we could probably buy 2 or 3 of the different compounds that are in there and get away with paying 50%, sometimes even less than that.
yeah, I actually
Um,
know someone who does that. Like I was talking to him about pre-workout. He does natural bodybuilding, and he was saying, "Oh, I don't take pre-workout, but I buy the caffeine pills." And
yeah,
said he'll just take like 400 milligrams of that before he trains, and he says he gets a pretty good effect from it. Um, I don't know, there's something about having a nice fruity caffeine drink before you train. I don't know why. Maybe it's my
oh yeah,
association with the old pre-workouts I was taking, and it might get me in the zone that way. But I
yeah,
don't know. Something about that, I really enjoy it. Like
yeah.
it's
So
like a
for some
ritual
people,
before I train. Like
right. For some people, it's also like you ever get the tingles when you're drinking your pre-workout? Some of the old ones,
sometimes I don't think this one has as much beta alanine. It doesn't
right?
have any beta alanine in it actually, but I've definitely had pre-workouts that have a lot of that. And you get the tingles, and the only
Yeah,
way to
yeah,
get rid of the tingles is to start moving. So
right. Because it feels like crap if you don't move, right?
yeah, you get
So
all
that's
itchy and you're like, yeah.
for some people that's super motivating, and it's really funny because if you look at a lot of the beta alanine formulations that are on the market, they're underdosed. So usually what they do is they just put beta alanine in there to give you the tingles. You're not really getting too much out of it,
Yeah.
but it's just enough to want to get you to move. So that's another example of just
Yeah.
people underdosing things.
Yeah. But
The worst case scenario, man, is like they have these things called proprietary blends. I wanted to get into that a little bit. And so that's when, and whenever people are buying supplements, this is actually like the number one thing that I want people to look at is does the supplement on the label have something blend or
yeah,
something
it's
matrix?
got the muscle blend, the hydration blend, and the energy blend.
Exactly. There you go. So I mean, so it'll have the lump total of weight there, right? So it'll have like 300 milligrams in this matrix or 2,000 milligrams of this matrix or that blend. But the thing is, with all those ingredients that are listed after that blend, you have no idea how much of those ingredients are actually in that total.
Well, in this label specifically, it's got a lot of integrity. I respect it. It's got the muscle blend, 5,000 milligrams, but it says L-citrulline, 2,000 milligrams,
Oh, good.
creatine, 1,750 milligrams, and so on. So
Right.
it tells you how much of each one. And
That's
I'm
good.
actually a really big advocate of this pre-workout because I've looked all the ingredients up and I've done my own research on it. I'm like, it's actually pretty mellow. It doesn't make me feel like I'm on drugs when I'm at the gym. And
Yeah.
it seems to work. Like I notice a benefit in my performance from it. But
Yeah.
that's
When
a
I was
good
looking
point
at the
though.
label,
Sometimes they'll put the blend and it'll say like energy blend. It'll be like caffeine, but it won't tell you how much caffeine. It's not going to tell you that there's 800 milligrams of caffeine in your
right.
pre-workout, like, which is an absurd amount. But yeah, it's a good point that you brought up there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always really sketched out when I can't readily find how much caffeine is in there because like,
You got to know, man. You got to know.
especially with caffeine, you've heard those stories of those kids who they're super unaccustomed to caffeine and then they end up chugging like a 16 ounce not monster, like a 16 ounce monster maybe, plus they have like a 5 hour energy and then they also drink something else on top of that, like a
Oh yeah,
massive soda, and they end up in the hospital.
that's not good
They
for
don't
your
know.
heart. Not
No,
at all.
definitely not. Like I could drink 400 milligrams of caffeine, I'd be totally fine though because I'm so accustomed to it. But
Yeah.
once again, not proud of that.
Yeah. But anyways, so I think we talked enough about pre-workout supplements. I want to bring up another supplement that's also very, very popular. Protein powder. Here I got my protein powder. It's
There you
the
go.
Veggie Elite Performance Protein. Um, who needs protein powder? Is this for everybody? Or is it only for people who do certain types of exercises or like, I don't know, what might make a person need a protein powder supplement?
Yeah, so I mean, protein is an essential macronutrient. So everyone needs protein, but you're kind of asking the question, who needs protein powder? Not necessarily anyone, right? So as long as you can consume your protein through varying sources. Um, I mean, if you're a meat eating person, right? If you eat an omnivorous diet, you can get your protein from various sources. You can get it from eggs, you can get it from milk, milk products, dairy in general. You can get it from animal sources. And typically, what we see is that animal sources are going to have the highest bioavailability of these proteins, which means that you can get away with consuming less of them and you'll get the maximum benefits because it's going to have, we'll get into amino acids in general, but it's going to have the full gamut of amino acids necessary.
Yeah.
Um, you can get away with that too if like, let's say that you're a vegan, right? That just
Yeah.
means that you need to be a little bit more educated in terms of the proteins that you're consuming. So if you're trying to get it from food, you need complementary sources. So like a peanut butter sandwich has proteins that are associated with the bread, the gluten protein, but it also has proteins that are associated with the peanuts. So if you combine those two things together, that's going to have more protein, like it's going to have complementary amino acids in it to give you that full.
Yeah.
There are 20 essential 20 amino acids. 9 of them are essential, so it's going to give you the full 20 that you'll need, and
Yeah.
going to be able to
So
take.
with this protein powder here, something I always look for is a combination of at least two different types of proteins. And I think my favorite combination, due to the variability and all the different types of amino acids you get, is peas and rice. And I'd even say if you could have a protein powder with more various different proteins in it, that would be good for a plant-based protein. But
Mhm.
Going off what you said, yeah, it's always good to have a variety of different proteins so that you can get all of those amino acids. Unless you are eating meat, then you don't have that problem.
Right.
I've complicated my life with the veganism now, so I got to get all these different proteins and be a bit more aware about that.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with educating yourself a little bit more, right?
Yeah,
But, I mean, you're training and whatnot too, and I was going to get into that a little bit. But individuals that exercise definitely need to be consuming a little bit more than the RDA, which is zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram.
yeah.
Um,
We actually had a discussion about that in the first episode of Gainz-Thirty. We're talking about like how much protein do you need, because we're talking
yeah,
about pre and post workout nutrition, and Denise Russo, the nutrition teacher, as well as Casey, the other guy I was interviewing, we all agreed that, yeah, the recommended daily value is pretty low for someone who's very physically active.
right.
So I think we ended up saying, about a gram per pound of body weight seems to be the number for someone who's physically active regularly. So yeah, we've covered a lot of that in this podcast already. So
Yeah.
if you haven't listened to that, make sure you go back and get the first episode. A lot of good information in there about protein.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there with a gram per pound is a pretty like thoughtless number in terms of like you don't have to put much thought into that number, not
Yeah.
like you're not disregarding any information. If you want to get even more specific than that, I mean, you can do like zero point 0.4 grams per kilogram of body weight per meal is what individuals like.
Oh, that's so much more math.
It is so much more math. It
More
is. It
accurate
is.
though. It's true.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it ends up being a relatively like simple number. I mean, so it ends up being like for me, that ends up being like 26 grams of protein per meal. And I mean, for some
And how
people,
many
I
meals
think,
are you eating though?
oh, I mean, so I'm probably eating 3 major meals, but the general idea, if you're trying to maximize protein synthesis, is you're trying to get in some type of protein in that threshold of like 20 to 30 grams for the most part, sometimes higher depending on how much muscle mass you have. You're trying to get that every 3-ish hours or so, 3 to 4-ish hours or so. So that might not be like having a full meal, but that could be, maybe a protein shake here or there. And then the benefits of doing that too are you tend to be a little bit more satiated. So if you have issues with your weight, that is definitely something that can help you out a little bit there.
Yeah, I think the protein powders make a good snack in between meals for someone who's trying to gain weight or gain muscle.
Right.
But like you said before, it's like it's definitely doable to get all your protein from food, vegan or not. I think anyone's able to do that. So, but
Definitely.
like for me, I use the protein powder because like I get sick of chewing things. It's like it's just so much more convenient just to like drink a protein shaker, add it into my smoothie, and get a little bit of protein there. But like a scoop of this has 24 grams of protein. If I wanted to
Yeah.
get 24 grams of protein from something like beans, it's like it's a lot of beans, there's a lot of fiber, there's a lot of space taken up in my stomach. It's a lot easier sometimes to drink a scoop of protein powder, and saves me a lot
Yeah.
of time and energy. So
Especially for vegetarians and vegans, like protein powder can be a godsend because it's the proteins that you do have access to. A lot of the plant proteins are, like you said, they're kind of filling, right? So you get beans, you're not just getting protein, you're getting carbs, you're also getting a lot of fiber in there.
yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like protein powder isn't necessary for everybody, but maybe now they'll understand the purpose of it and how they can fit it in if they feel like they need it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always recommend counting how much protein you get per day and then assessing if you need a protein powder. If you've never, tracked your nutrition and seen how many grams of protein you consume regularly, it's probably not a good idea to just start consuming the protein powder. It's probably best to, make sure you actually need the additional protein before you go and spend your
Yeah.
money on a supplement. Because like you said before about, I think the pre-workouts, it costs money, and, it might not be the most cost effective way to get your protein. So
Hmm. Yeah. I think too, a lot of people think like, oh, can I have too much protein? And I mean, it's kind of like with the creatine thing. If you have kidneys that are compromised, then there might be some issues with that. But otherwise, even people that have kidney issues, like kidney disease, there is a specific protein recommendation for them. It's just a little bit harder to get that sometimes. But it's definitely not, protein categorically isn't just bad for them.
yeah.
Um, But I mean, like up in the literature, they've studied doses up to 4.4 grams per kilogram per day of protein for, weeks. So that's 2 grams per pound of body weight.
Oh wow,
And
that's
they've
a
shown what
lot.
ends up, yeah, it is a lot. And
I
they've
couldn't
shown that
imagine eating all that.
basically it's a lot. And I mean, it's really hard to get that from anything but taking protein powder or like topping everything off with protein powder.
Hmm.
But I mean, what they showed is that like even when you consumed an excess of calories and the majority of that excess coming from protein, that people weren't gaining fat from that, which I think is really cool because protein itself is like actually metabolically very difficult to convert into fat. It's possible,
Yeah, it's just it
but
takes a lot of energy because you got to convert it from
right,
protein, break down all the amino acids, then convert it back to either glucose or fat. So
right. And then
seems
the
like it
the
might
hormone,
take a little bit more energy just to break it
yeah,
down. So
yeah, you have to start converting things here and there. And I mean, most of the time you're going to be stimulating the opposite hormones too, because protein itself actually does have a little bit of an insulin spike release related to it. So it makes more sense that protein would not end up being as fat than as compared to something like carbohydrate or excess carbohydrate or fat content.
okay. So earlier we talked about amino acids. We mentioned how the protein breaks down into amino acids. I know there's a lot of supplements on the market that are amino acids, like they got branch chain amino acids, they got individual amino acids. You know, what are the purpose of these supplements? And a lot of questions I ask on here, I kind of know the answer, but amino acids are a type of supplement that I really am not too sure what the purpose is, considering that if I just took a scoop of that protein powder, I would break it down and get amino acids from it.
Mhm.
And I should be getting most of the amino acids because there's two different types of proteins in there. So, what is the purpose of getting a supplement that is broken down into amino acids already?
Yeah. So I think you definitely hit the nail on the head there when it comes to if you're consuming adequate amounts of protein from protein supplements or from your diet, excess amino acids probably aren't going to be benefiting you all that much. But there are other reasons that people consume in either mixes of amino acids or individual amino acids. One of the primary ones that people kind of take in isolation is going to be leucine. So leucine itself is what we call like it's like a target nutrient for increasing muscle protein synthesis. So leucine itself can actually help with mTOR regulation, which is basically the master regulator of protein synthesis. So that complex actually senses leucine content or leucine concentrations and can increase things like protein synthesis if you're consuming um, a specific amount of it. And that tends to be like two to
Okay.
four.
Is leucine, is that an essential or a non-essential amino acid?
That is an essential amino acid. So
Okay.
it's an
Wait, we
essential
need
and
to clarify what the difference between those two are because I feel like a
sure,
lot of the listeners might not know what an essential versus a non-essential amino acid is.
definitely.
Do you want to explain to us what the difference would be?
Sure. Yeah. So we have 20 amino acids. 9 of them are going to be essential, which means that we need to consume them in our diet because we don't make them. And then the other 11 are non-essential, meaning that we actually can make them. There are some amino acids that are considered conditionally essential, which means that depending on the conditions, we might need more of them. An example of that would be glutamine. So glutamine was really popular back in the day, and it's nowadays the role is more relegated to like gut health. So the gut actually the cells of the gut actually prefer glutamine as their primary fuel, which is I think is really interesting. So it helps maintain gut integrity. But
Mhm.
yeah, another thing that it can do is it can help with immunity. So let's say that you're kind of exercising, you're kind of like in a state where you're borderline, like maybe you're thinking that your training is a little bit too difficult. You might be getting closer to like a state of quote unquote overreaching or kind of what people usually consider to be overtraining. You might be suppressing your immune system a little bit, so that demand for that glutamine is going to go up. So that's one
Okay.
example.
For people who are like overreaching and getting to
Yeah.
that point, should they be consuming those specific amino acids, or do you think they'd be okay if they were just eating adequate amounts of protein in their diet?
Honestly, I think that if they were I think that a lot of people too, they understand that protein is associated with recovery. So I think the intuitive thing would be if you are exercising kind of more thoroughly or more comprehensively, that you're going to be consuming more protein anyway. So your bases are probably covered in that sense. The only
Okay.
scenario I can think of where you might need to worry about consuming individual amino acids in the context of sport is like, let's say you're doing like a bodybuilding show and you're trying to basically cut down on as many calories as possible. So you don't necessarily want to be consuming like a whole bunch of food where you might need like oil and other stuff in order to make it taste better, make it more palatable. So sometimes things like individual amino acids like leucine can help you get, or sometimes you'll have essential amino acids as a supplement themselves nowadays where you can consume that. And that might be a decent way of getting more of those essential amino acids in there without having to consume the food. And you can use some of those other calories towards other things like carbohydrates that might actually help you fuel your workout a little better.
Okay, that's a really good point because I've done a bodybuilding show before. It was in 2019. I did men's physique,
Nice.
and I actually did begin to consume an amino acid supplement pretty much for the reason you were saying. I was like, okay, I'm decreasing my calories, and what I would do is I would drink it before I would do like my cardio.
Hmm.
So like I would work out, I would go eat, but then I was like, okay, I don't want to eat again before I do my cardio. I would drink some amino acids as a desperate attempt to hold on to my muscle mass,
Right.
which unfortunately I did lose a lot of muscle mass through that cutting phase. I didn't have a coach or anything. I was just kind of
Yeah.
doing it on my own. But
I'm assuming you were natural too. So
yeah, I
there's
was
that.
doing it naturally, so that made it a lot more difficult to hold my muscle while I was getting super lean. But I did consume the amino acid supplement and, just to, like you said, just to like, provide my body with those amino acids when I wasn't getting quite enough of them in my diet.
Hmm.
So, for someone who is planning on competing in bodybuilding, are there any certain amino acids, like you mentioned, like the lysine? Was it leucine or lysine?
Leucine.
You mentioned the leucine was good for muscle protein synthesis. Is that something that would be good to consume on its own when someone is like cutting down and trying to lose weight in order to maintain their muscle mass?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that if you can afford to consume the whole proteins, that's going to be a little bit better. I think sometimes people will think about consuming branch chain amino acids in an attempt to just get more general leucine in there.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the problems with that is that those three branch chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, they actually compete for transport in the gut. So what can end up happening
Okay.
is you're getting more leucine and isoleucine, but you're getting more valine and isoleucine, but you're not getting the leucine that you actually need to help
Oh,
stimulate
okay.
muscle protein synthesis. So in some scenarios, I've actually seen data that shows that leucine plus protein, like protein supplementation, is actually going to elicit an even better muscle protein synthetic effect. But I would definitely say that, I mean, if you can afford to just have the protein, go ahead and have the protein.
Yeah.
Otherwise, an essential amino acid supplement is going to be better with maybe even a little bit more leucine topped on top of that if you're trying to maintain as much muscle mass as possible.
Yeah. All right. I got one last question for you, Steven.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific supplement recommendations for someone trying to build muscle? Like if someone came to you and said, "Hey, I'm trying to build muscle. This is my diet. It's pretty dialed in. This is my exercise regimen. I'm on a progressive overload." Is there any supplements that you would recommend to them to take to help get the most out of their progress?
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, there's a handful of supplements out there, and I mean, if there's a million supplements that are available, and it seems like there's probably only like 5 to 10 that I would actually say have enough evidence to support them. But first and foremost, what you would probably want to do is make sure that all of their T's are crossed and I's are dotted when it comes to their diet, right? So do they have a training program that's well organized, and do they have a good plan for progression? That's probably the first thing you want to keep in mind. And then do they have the nutrition to support that? Is their protein kind of within that range that we had talked about? Um, Carbohydrate wise, I think carbohydrates really slept on when it comes to training, especially now that keto is super popular. But I've even seen in some circles, like Dr. Eric Helms, who's pretty popular in like the natural bodybuilding realm, he's actually recommended that instead of just kind of increasing protein when people are getting close to doing a bodybuilding show, even increasing carbohydrate can actually help to improve your overall training like the training stimulus, right? Because if you have more energy to work out, then you're going to be getting a better stimulus from your training, which, I mean, at the end of the day, the main thing that's driving the accretion of muscle or muscle gain is going to be the training stimulus. You can't just sit here and eat protein and gain muscle. You need to have a training stimulus and the
Yeah,
protein
of
to
course.
support that. So if your protein is taken care of, your carbohydrates are taken care of, and your training is well structured and intelligent, I would definitely say creatine is the first thing that you can go ahead and do. Caffeine, definitely. I definitely don't think that there's as much evidence on caffeine to support it as there is with things like endurance training. That's just because there's more evidence on endurance and aerobic training in general. But there's definitely a growing body of literature behind the caffeine. Some other stuff that we had mentioned, beta alanine is one of those. So beta alanine, short rundown on how that works is you have beta alanine that you're consuming. It combines with an amino acid, L-histidine, that you make inside of your body. So that's going to be, actually histidine is an essential amino acid. So you're going to be needing to consume that through the diet as well. But those two things are going to combine and they're going to form a compound called carnosine, which can actually help to buffer acid. So when you're exercising, what that means is that when you're producing more acidity as your muscles are contracting, that beta alanine that you consumed is going to be able to prevent that acidity from stopping your contraction. So it basically helps you work out for longer. Some other stuff that is going to help you. So something like citrulline malate is going to be really beneficial. That's kind of like what I would consider to be, or what other people would consider to be, like a B tier supplement. So not something that is like your first thing to go to, but if you have the excess funds, there's a decent enough amount of evidence to support the consumption of that. And all that really does that, or like, let's say you're a vegan, so you probably have a lot better consumption of things like dietary nitrates, things like spinach, things like beets. Those are going to have the nitrate in them that you're trying to get. But ultimately, what citrulline malate is doing is it's helping to increase the amount of nitric oxide that's available. So what that's going to do is it's going to improve blood flow. So that can be really beneficial, especially if you're like doing types of exercise that are going to be a little bit longer. If they're not power based exercises, and you have periods where you have low rest times and you're contracting for long periods of time, that's going to be really beneficial. Other than that, we talked a little bit about the betaine. That's kind of what I would also consider to be a B level supplement. And the good thing about betaine is that it's also pretty cheap. It can work through a few different means, but what we kind of see in the literature is that it improves muscular endurance. So it kind of does that by sitting in the cell and then helping to maintain the protein structures within it. So that might mean that you can do, 10 reps on bench press at 70% of one rep max or 80% of one rep max instead of 8. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you can get 2 extra reps per session for, months upon potentially even years, that's going to be a better training stimulus to be able to get more muscle and potentially more strength out of that.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, so I think that covers most of the ones out there. There are other things that you can try taking, like a lot of the nootropics that are out there. Definitely kind of try those at your own risk.
It's more
especially
experimental. I feel like there's not as much research on a lot of those things, but
right.
people have found that they work, but it's like, at what cost? Like
Yeah,
we don't
like
really know yet.
physically, what's the economic cost is usually the issue there, because a lot of these things, they're herbal, so it's not like you're taking some type of amphetamine where the risk of addiction is really, really high, or just like long-term damage could be really high with chronic use. A lot of these things that are herbal, like they're pretty safe in terms of like the overall impact they have on your physiology is pretty modest compared to these things. But still, the cost or the side effects are pretty unknown. So some of these herbal supplements, it's probably good to get blood work if you're using them for long periods of time, because you have no idea. Some of these things might cause some elevated liver enzymes, things of that nature, if you're not paying attention and taking them in large doses or taking them for long periods of time.
Okay. Yeah, you made a lot of good supplement recommendations. I would agree with a lot of them. Taking a lot of those things you mentioned. probably all of them at some point in a
Yeah,
pre-workout cocktail. But
right.
one thing I want to add for vegans, it'd probably be good to consume a vitamin B12 supplement
That is fair. Yeah,
because
vitamin
there's no
B12.
vitamin B12 in any plant-based sources. Um, in theory, we used to all get it a long time ago from water, just like kind of bacteria is in water. But now we
Oh
treat our
yeah,
water. There's chlorine, and they put all that in there. They kill all of the bacteria so that there's no bad bacterias. Obviously, a
right.
good thing in today's society because we got things in the environment that aren't so good for us. But yeah, so vitamin B12 comes from a bacteria, and basically we used to consume the bacteria and get our B12 from that. And it's found in meat and dairy products, but not in plant-based things. So it's
Right.
good to consume vitamin B12 if you're vegan. And I was just wondering if you had any um, recommendations on the dosage because I have this supplement right here. It is 1,000 micrograms of cyanocobalamin.
Cyanocobalamin. Yep, that's
Yeah, and that's
the
the bacteria that we derive the B12 from. But it has 1,000 micrograms, and it says it's 41,667% of my daily value of vitamin B12. Do I need to be taking this much vitamin B12?
so yeah, I mean, if you're taking that much vitamin B12, like you probably don't need to be taking that much. But at the same time, the harm isn't really going to be there. So vitamin B12 is it's a water soluble vitamin. So you have water and fat soluble ones. I'd be much more concerned if you were taking large percentages, like relatively speaking, of something like vitamin D, vitamin A, K, or E,
Yeah.
just because those things are going to accumulate over time, and there's more danger for adverse effect with something like that. But let's say that you overconsume a B vitamin, vitamin C, something of that nature. Usually, the risk for toxicity is really low, just because you're going to end up peeing out the rest of it. So the water soluble portion just means that it's pretty readily excreted if you overconsume more than you need.
Yeah. So do you know anything about the bioavailability of it? Like am I like if I took a much less dose, like I usually take these tablets, I break them in half when I consume
Yeah,
it because I'm like
yeah.
it'll last me twice as long. If I do that, am I not going to get enough B12? Like, am I only getting like a certain percentage of what's in this supplement? Or
No, I mean that's a good question. I think that the dosage that's on there, and definitely fact check me on this. I mean that's what you're that is based off of what you would be assimilating or what you would be digesting. But like you said, vitamin B12 is something that is like more essential for people that are vegan or vegetarian to consume. Also, people that are elderly, so like older individuals, not just because they don't eat as much meat, but also because over time they lose access to things like hydrochloric acid in their stomach. So your stomach makes acid to break things down, but that hydrochloric acid also helps with other factors that are inside of the stomach that help to bind to B12. So it helps with the bioavailability in that way.
okay, so
So
everyone's bioavailability might be different.
yeah,
So
exactly, and
they
it
kind of
affects
overshoot it
people.
just to make sure everyone's able to get enough from it.
Yeah, and I'm actually not entirely sure why they usually overdose some of these vitamins so much. I think part of the reason for that is just to ensure that everyone is covered, but at the same time, also because I don't think that there's a lot of harm in over consuming them to that degree. I'm not saying to go and eat the entire bottle because you would probably have, right? Like everyone always
Yeah.
makes those jumps. If it's hard to overdose, people assume that means that it's impossible to overdose, but it's definitely not impossible to do that. So, I mean, if you look at something like emergency, for instance, right? That's vitamin C. Basically, just it's a really, really high dose of vitamin C. I'm assuming it's been a long time since I've taken it, but I think like a dose of emergency typically is like,
Like over
uh,
1,000%
yeah,
of
it's
your
like
daily
over a
value,
thousand
some
percent,
ridiculous
right?
amount. Like, and
And
you're
for
not
most people,
utilizing all of that, like,
right,
like you
right,
said, it
and
gets excreted.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. So you just end up peeing out the rest of it because it's a water soluble vitamin, just like the rest.
Yeah.
But I mean, B12 is essential. Like you said, like B12, if you don't have vitamin B12, there's a few different things that it does. But vitamin B12 is essential for what we consider to be methyl reactions or one carbon reactions. So it helps you create your own body's stores of creatine, helps to produce melatonin, helps produce like adrenaline. It also helps with like your body's ability to like turn genes on and off. So if you don't have B12, like it's a very, very important vitamin to have, especially for supporting a lot of those roles in like other things like red blood cell differentiation and proliferation. So
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'm glad I consumed that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, most people usually don't have to
Yeah.
worry about it if they're, if they're not restricted, if they have an omnivorous diet, but I
Hmm.
definitely think you do, and I definitely think that
Yeah.
some elderly people also need a lot of B12 or
Yeah.
more B12 than they're already consuming.
So I'd say most of these supplements that we mentioned today, completely optional, but I'd say if you're vegan, that B12 supplement, it's not an optional thing. That's something you should be consuming. I've done a bit of research on it on my own, and I've heard you can get certain cognitive declines from it if you're not consuming enough. So
Yeah, that's a
yeah,
good point.
I'd say it's single-handedly the most important supplement for a vegan to be consuming.
Right.
Um,
Other things too. I
so
mean, like iron, right? So iron
yeah,
is going to be a little less bioavailable for in non-heme sources, so ones that
yeah,
aren't attached to that hemoglobin. So I mean, you have to be a little bit more aware of what you're consuming. So you can increase absorption by having, like a spritz of lemon in your salad or something like that. That acid will help that.
really. I never
Yeah,
knew that. That's pretty
yeah.
cool.
So if you have some acid with your iron, it'll help make it more available if it's coming from a plant source.
That's pretty cool. I usually get tons of iron. I eat mostly unprocessed whole foods, so there's
Right,
tons of iron and all that, oats, spinach, and nuts and seeds, and
right.
there's pretty much iron in everything I eat.
Yeah,
I try not to eat those empty calories because eating a plant-based diet's a lot more detrimental to be eating things like that than
right.
compared to the whole unprocessed foods. We could talk for hours about all the different supplements out there, but we just gave you a little rundown about some of the more common, more popular ones. And turns out some of them can be pretty safe and effective. Others, not so much. Definitely can be effective, but not so much safe. But you all have the information now. You're slightly educated enough to make your own decision. I always highly recommend doing your own research on these things. Um, these are just two perspectives about supplements, and there's tons of perspectives out there that you can learn from. But I always recommend to everyone just do your own research, and that's the most important thing. Like making sure that that supplement is right for you in the situation that you're in. Well, thank you for coming on here today, Steven. I really appreciate you taking your time. Do you have any final words for the listeners?
No, I think that you did a really good job, Mitch, and I think that the listenership is going to be all the more educated when they decide to supplement with things. And I guess the only other thing is, whenever you're making major changes to your diet and all that, it definitely helps to become educated. But major changes to things, it never hurts to consult the professionals. So consult your general physician and consult a
Yes, I
registered
agree.
dietitian. Personally, like as someone who did their undergrad degree in dietetics, I definitely understand like the limitations of like general. I'm not saying that doctors don't know anything about nutrition, but their information that they have about nutrition is fairly limited. So I think that it's better to outsource some of that information sometimes to a registered dietitian. I mean, that's their entire gig is going out there and educating people about good nutritional practices. So
Yes, I
that's
agree
always
entirely.
worthwhile. Yeah. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk to you. And I'm glad that I was able to, get through the podcast without, tripping over my words every other sentence. So
Yeah. I got one more question for you.
sure.
Told us in class, but can you tell everyone how much you sumo deadlift?
Yeah. So I can sumo deadlift 534. So,
And
at
what's your
100.
body weight?
So I weigh 160. I don't know if I can do that right now, but I could definitely do over 500 right now. I don't know if I could pull 534.
That's almost 3 times his body weight. That's pretty impressive. You don't see very
Yeah.
many people in the gym pulling that much more than their own body weight. Like to put things in perspective, I'm like 200, 210 pounds, and I could deadlift 455. So a little bit more than 2 times my body weight. But
Yeah.
Steven's over here, he's lighter than me, and he's pulling more weight off the floor. I thought that was pretty impressive. I
I
wanted
appreciate
you to
that.
have the opportunity to flex that to everybody at the end of the
Thank you.
podcast. So
Well, I'll throw in the caveat that it's sumo, so some people don't think that it actually counts.
I consider it counting. I mean, like
All
it's
right.
game and powerlifting, so yeah,
Yeah, there you go.
it's up
Well,
to
thanks for the
powerlifting
idea.
standard. But
And my bench press is embarrassing, so I won't talk about
yeah,
that.
you
That's
don't have to
usually
share
not
that one.
fun.
That's all
Yeah, won't do that.
right.
Thank you. Thank you for not
Yeah.
making me do that.
After listening to this episode, you probably realized there's tons of different supplements out there. There's good ones, there's bad ones, there's ones that are safe, there's ones that aren't, there are ones that are effective, and there are ones that don't really serve much of a purpose for most populations. Hopefully, today you're able to learn something. Maybe you learned that you're not the type of person to be taking a supplement. Or maybe you learned that there's a certain supplement you need to be taking in order to progress in your fitness a little bit more. Regardless of your level of supplementation knowledge, I'm here to help you if you have any further questions about supplements. You can always reach out to me on Instagram. You can find that in the description of this podcast. And you can send me a message, and I'd be glad to answer any questions and even guide you to a certain resource that has more information about the topic. If you check the description of this video, you'll be able to find some resources that show you the scientific literature behind these supplements that we mentioned. Specifically, creatine, there's tons of research out there about it. If you don't believe us, you can look at the raw research and confirm what we're saying. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it if you made it this far in the episode. It means a lot to me. You can always leave a comment on the video with some feedback and let me know a way that I can improve the show. I'm always here accepting feedback, so if you have any, please don't hesitate to let me know. See you next time.